Emma, Chloe and Niamh weren't just sisters and cousins. They were the architects of Liverpool's most secretive criminal empire. While the city slept, they were building a network that would outsmart rival gangs, evade the police, and rewrite the rules of power in the underworld. This is the story of the Birds, a matriarchy that rose from the shadows and shocked the streets of Liverpool like never before. Liverpool has always carried the weight of its reputation for tough streets and organized crime. For decades, it was the men who dominated the headlines, their names tied to robberies, smuggling, and bloody feuds. But quietly, almost unnoticed at first, a different kind of power began to grow. In the early 2010s, a group of women who had lived in the shadows of the city's gangland culture started to form something new. They were partners, sisters and daughters of established criminals, women who had learned the trade by watching from the sidelines. Where others saw them as background figures, they saw an opportunity. Tired of playing secondary roles, they began shaping their own path, slowly pulling together a network that would become known as the Birds. Their rise did not start with violence or intimidation, but with patience and intelligence. These women had studied the mistakes of the men around them. They had seen how pride and arrogance could bring down entire empires. They had watched how flashy lifestyles made criminals vulnerable, how greed led to betrayals, and how careless violence drew the eyes of the police. Learning from these failures, they planned their moves carefully. Their strategy was simple: operate under the radar, make money without attracting unnecessary attention, and rely on bonds of loyalty that would be harder to break than any blood oath sworn by their male counterparts. What made them different was their ability to blend into everyday life. Unlike the men who flaunted their success with luxury cars and loud behavior, the women built their empire quietly. They used legitimate businesses as covers, often in industries no one would suspect. Hair salons, cleaning firms, and small shops became fronts for laundering money and moving product. To the outside world, they were businesswomen, mothers, and neighbors. Behind closed doors, however, they were laying the foundations of a cartel that would eventually rival the most notorious gangs of Liverpool. At the start, many dismissed them. Police officers, rival criminals, and even their own associates underestimated their reach. The very idea of women running a criminal empire seemed laughable to some. But that underestimation was their greatest weapon. While the men fought bloody turf wars and end headlines with shootouts and arrests, the Birds built quietly, carefully, and without drawing attention. They spread their influence through family networks, relying on trust that was deeper than money. Mothers recruited daughters, sisters backed each other, and cousins formed the outer circles of the organization. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal was not easily forgiven. By the time whispers of their existence began circulating in the underworld, they were already powerful enough to control large portions of Liverpool's drug supply. They had money, influence, and connections that stretched far beyond Merseyside. And yet on the surface, they appeared invisible. Few photographs existed, their names were rarely mentioned in police reports, and their lives seemed ordinary. But beneath that surface lay the beginnings of what would be called the new Mafia Matriarchy, a network that would challenge not only rival gangs but also the very structure of organized crime in the UK. The Birds understood early that violence was not the most effective path to control. While rival gangs carved up Liverpool's streets with knives and guns, the women focused on strategy. They were students of observation, watching carefully how traditional cartels operated, and then shaping their own unique methods. Instead of storming into territory, they slipped through unnoticed, weaving their influence into places no one thought to check. Their smuggling lines were not built through nightclubs or flashy couriers, but through mundane and overlooked parts of society. A beauty salon could be more useful than a safe house, and a delivery van carrying packages of cosmetics might conceal far more valuable cargo than it seemed. The way they operated was deliberate. They avoided attention by making their businesses blend into the fabric of the city. Small cleaning service became a perfect way to move items in and out of homes without raising suspicion. A care home provided legitimate supply chains that could be exploited for discreet transport. Even courier firms that handled everyday parcels became routes for drugs that slipped seamlessly through the system. While the men in the city battled openly, the Birds chose to stay quiet, letting their empire grow in the shadows. Part of their strength came from discipline. They didn't allow reckless behavior. Any woman brought into the circle was reminded that greed and impatience could destroy everything. They studied how law enforcement worked and knew exactly which mistakes to avoid. Mobile phones were kept to a minimum, conversations were disguised in code, and meetings took place in ordinary settings where nobody would think to look twice. It was a level of control that gave them a huge advantage over the chaotic feuds raging in the male-led gangs. This discipline allowed them to expand without being noticed. By relying on family and close female friends, they built a network that was bound by ties stronger than money alone. Sisters trusted sisters, mothers trusted daughters, and those ties meant betrayal was rare. To outsiders, it looked like small circles of women meeting in cafes or family gatherings. But those moments were where shipments were arranged, money was allocated, and decisions were made about how to grow further. The Birds also understood appearances. They dressed and acted like ordinary women, blending into the everyday life of Liverpool. Some held jobs that looked entirely legitimate. Others appeared to be busy raising families. This ability to live double lives kept them out of suspicion's reach. While detectives chased flashy drug dealers with fast cars and gold jewelry, the Birds invested in modest homes and small, clean businesses. They were hiding in plain sight, invisible to anyone not looking closely. Their methods began to pay off quickly. Shipments came in with few disruptions. Money flowed steadily, and rivals began to notice that someone was operating quietly yet effectively. By the time their name began to circulate in whispers, the Birds had already secured reliable supply chains from Europe, established a loyal workforce, and built a reputation for being untouchable. They weren't the loudest or the most feared yet, but they were the most effective. And in the shadows of Liverpool's criminal world, effectiveness was everything. The first real clue that something unusual was happening came not from violence on the streets, but from the quiet patterns of money moving through Liverpool's banks. Detectives working on routine financial checks began to notice small but consistent deposits being made into multiple accounts spread across the city. The amounts were not large enough to trigger alarms individually, but together they formed a suspicious trail. It was as if someone had carefully designed the flow of cash to stay under the radar. At first, investigators assumed it was a minor laundering scheme tied to low-level dealers. What they had stumbled upon, however, was the financial backbone of the Bird. The cartel had chosen to move its money differently from the men who flaunted their wealth. Instead of expensive cars, extravagant jewelry, or nights out that screamed attention, they used patience and subtlety. They invested in property, terraced houses that looked ordinary but multiplied quietly across the city. They bought small businesses that nobody thought twice about, laundrettes, cafes, and corner shops. On the surface, these ventures looked unremarkable, but beneath the paperwork they served as perfect vehicles for laundering thousands of pounds each week. The police, who were used to chasing after gangs that lived loudly, struggled to keep pace with criminals who knew how to hide in plain sight. One slip almost cost them everything. An accountant working with one of the small businesses noticed irregularities that didn't add up. While most clients were straightforward, this particular set of records seemed carefully arranged, too neat, as though someone was deliberately disguising larger sums. Sensing something was wrong, the accountant tipped off financial investigators. That quiet call opened the door for the National Crime Agency to step in. From that moment, the Birds were no longer invisible. Investigators began piecing together how the money flowed. They found that the cartel avoided cash-heavy operations that could be raided. Instead, money was layered carefully, moved in small amounts across multiple accounts before being funneled into property deals. Detectives noticed patterns of purchases that looked ordinary until they were linked together. A beauty salon on one street, a cafe 3 miles away, and a series of modest homes all bought within months of each other. When the trail was mapped, it revealed a spider's web stretching across Liverpool. The brilliance of their system lay in its simplicity. By keeping their deposits small and their businesses believable, they stayed beneath the threshold that normally alerted the banks. The network was designed to mimic everyday life, blending criminal profits with the hum of regular commerce. Detectives later admitted that without the tip-off, the cartel might have operated for years without detection. The financial picture painted a startling reality. The Birds were not just surviving, they were thriving. Conservative estimates suggested millions had already passed through their system. What began as whispers of women running a few small operations was now confirmed as something much larger. For the first time, authorities realized they were facing not a background crew, but a fully formed cartel led with precision and discipline. The money trail had exposed the matriarchy hiding in the heart of Liverpool. The growth of the Birds did not stop at Liverpool's borders. Once their system of laundering and small-scale supply chains was perfected, they began to look outward. The women knew that to secure true power, they would need international connections, the kind that could guarantee a steady flow of high-quality product. They started small, reaching out to contacts in Spain through friends and relatives who had moved abroad. What began as occasional shipments hidden in freight quickly grew into something far more ambitious. Within a few years they had established direct links with suppliers in Spain and Holland, connections that gave them access to cocaine at a scale that rivaled some of the city's most established gangs. The Birds were clever in how they handled these partnerships. They avoided the brash, confrontational style that often defined male-led negotiations. Instead, they built their reputation on reliability and discretion. When shipments were promised, they arrived. When payments were due, they were made on time. This professional approach made them attractive partners to European suppliers who were tired of dealing with hot-headed gangsters who let ego interfere with business. In time, the Birds secured stable relationships that allowed them to expand rapidly without unnecessary conflict. To move product across borders, they leaned on their greatest strength, the ability to blend in. Younger women, often relatives with clean criminal records, were used as couriers. They carried drugs hidden in luggage, vehicles, or even disguised as everyday goods. A mother traveling with her children aroused little suspicion at airports or ferry terminals. Yet her suitcase might contain hidden compartments filled with cocaine. Delivery vans loaded with cosmetics or clothing often carried far more valuable cargo tucked away behind legitimate items. Each successful trip strengthened the network's reach and emboldened its leaders. The matriarchy was more than just a criminal organization. It was a culture built on loyalty and discipline. Younger recruits admired the senior women who balanced motherhood and family life with ruthless efficiency in business. The Birds created a structure that encouraged loyalty through personal bonds, rather than fear alone. Betrayal was still unthinkable, but unlike male gangs where threats and violence were used to keep order, the Birds relied on a sense of belonging and shared ambition. For many of the women, being part of the cartel offered respect, money, and security in ways they had never experienced before. By the late 2010s, whispers of their reach began to ripple through the underworld. Rivals who had once dismissed the idea of women running serious operations now found themselves losing ground. The Birds were not interested in public displays of dominance, yet their influence was undeniable. Supply chains were controlled, prices were dictated, and smaller dealers who wanted product often had to go through them. Their reputation grew quietly but steadily, and with it came an aura of untouchability. For law enforcement, the challenge became even greater. The Birds operated across borders, involved in international trafficking, while keeping their activities at home almost invisible. Their mixture of family loyalty, strategic discipline, and international reach made them unlike any cartel the city had seen before. Liverpool had produced many powerful gangs, but none like this. The new Mafia Matriarchy was no longer just a local rumor, it was becoming a European network with a firm grip on the city's underworld. The Birds' rise did not go unnoticed forever. As their influence stretched from Liverpool to European ports, law enforcement began to realize that something new was unfolding beneath the surface. The National Crime Agency had already mapped their suspicious financial activity, But the scale of their smuggling network required more than just following the money. Task forces were formed with one objective: dismantle the female-led cartel before it became unstoppable. Yet the police soon discovered that these women were far more disciplined than the chaotic gangs they were used to confronting. Every step forward in the investigation seemed to reveal only more layers of protection. Surveillance was the first weapon deployed. Unmarked cars trailed suspected members, cameras watched businesses linked to the Birds, and undercover officers tried to blend into the quiet spaces where decisions might be made. But the cartel operated with a level of caution that frustrated investigators at every turn. Meetings were often disguised as family gatherings, conversations reduced to fragments scribbled on paper and destroyed immediately after use. The women avoided traditional pitfalls like burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. They understood that the police expected digital trails, so they left almost none. Wiretaps provided little progress. The Birds had perfected the art of speaking in code, disguising shipments as hair dye orders, cleaning contracts, or bulk cosmetic deliveries. To an outsider, the words seemed ordinary, but inside the network, each phrase carried precise meaning. Detectives sometimes spent weeks untangling a conversation, only to realize the actual meeting or shipment had already taken place. The frustration grew within the task force, who began to accept they were not chasing ordinary criminals, but strategists who had studied their methods as carefully as the police studied theirs. Undercover operatives faced their own difficulties. Unlike male gangs that welcomed outsiders for muscle or quick money, the Birds relied almost entirely on family and lifelong trust. To infiltrate their world was nearly impossible. Most members were related by blood or bound by ties stretching back decades. Any new face was examined with suspicion, and a single mistake could expose an operative instantly. Law enforcement found themselves locked out of the very structure they were trying to bring down. With traditional methods failing, the police shifted focus to the cartel's international movements. Intelligence from Spain and Holland confirmed that women with clean records were frequently traveling between ports known for drug trafficking. Yet even then, searches often turned up nothing. The Birds had mastered concealment techniques, hiding product in double-sealed containers, disguised packaging, and even inside shipments of 80 supplies or food products that no officer wanted to disrupt in front of families. Every failed interception strengthened the cartel's reputation for being untouchable. Despite the setbacks, investigators refused to give up. They began pooling intelligence from multiple agencies, sharing fragments of information that, when pieced together, revealed patterns in travel, banking, and property deals. It was slow, painstaking work, but gradually a clearer picture emerged. The Birds were running a professional, disciplined cartel, one that could not be dismantled with brute force alone. For the task force, the challenge was clear. To bring down the new Mafia Matriarchy, they would need patience, precision, and a strategy as sharp as the women they were chasing. Even the most disciplined empires are vulnerable to internal pressure, and for the Birds, cracks began to appear in the unlikeliest of places. Their organization had always been built on family and loyalty, but those bonds, strong as they seemed, could not prevent human emotion from intruding. A dispute erupted between two cousins over a missing shipment of cocaine that had vanished somewhere between Liverpool and Spain. What should have been a routine operation turned into a tense standoff, with accusations flying and threats quietly exchanged. It was the first real disruption in a network that had, until then, operated with near-perfect efficiency. The argument quickly spread beyond the two cousins. Others within the cartel were forced to take sides. The careful hierarchy that had been maintained for years began to wobble as loyalty was tested. Younger couriers, many of whom were relatives or trusted friends, started feeling uneasy. They had always followed orders without question, but the open tension made them aware of the risks they had been insulated from. Fear began to creep into the network, and for the first time, discipline and secrecy were under threat from within. Law enforcement, monitoring quietly from the sidelines, detected signs of this internal turmoil. Agents noticed unusual communications, meetings in unexpected locations, sudden cancellations, and a flurry of encrypted messages that hinted at conflict. Detectives realized that the perfect structure they had been chasing was beginning to unravel. They redirected resources to exploit these vulnerabilities, focusing on individuals who might be persuaded to cooperate. The intelligence suggested that the Birds' strength family loyalty could also be their greatest weakness. It was a young courier, barely 20, who became the pivotal point. She had witnessed threats between her cousins and feared for her own safety. For months she had been carrying shipments across Europe without incident, but now she saw cracks in the matriarchy that had always seemed untouchable. Under immense pressure, she made the fateful decision to cooperate with law enforcement. Her testimony revealed details that investigators had been struggling to uncover: hidden stash houses in Liverpool, secret routes across the continent, and the names of senior members who had been carefully shielded. Once her information was verified, police moved quickly. The internal division within the Birds had created confusion and lowered morale. Leaders were distracted, attempting to resolve family disputes while also maintaining the flow of operations. Detectives realized that timing was crucial. Any delay could allow the cartel to regroup. For the first time, law enforcement had a clear blueprint of the organization and a means to act decisively. The impact on the cartel was immediate. Suspicion ran rampant among members. Trust evaporated almost overnight. The sophisticated network that had once seemed impenetrable now faced a cascade of problems it could not easily fix. Shipments were delayed, communication faltered, and fear began to replace loyalty. The Birds, who had once operated with near-total control, were suddenly vulnerable. The internal collapse, combined with law enforcement's growing advantage, marked a turning point in the battle. The empire that had been quietly building across Liverpool and Europe was beginning to crack from within. For the first time, it became clear that even the most disciplined matriarchy could not survive the combined pressures of betrayal, fear, and relentless police scrutiny. By the time law enforcement was ready to strike, months of preparation had gone into every detail. The Birds had built a sprawling network across Liverpool, Manchester, and even parts of southern Europe, but the cracks exposed in the previous months gave police the leverage they needed. Dawn was chosen for the raids, a time when visibility was low and suspects were least alert. Multiple units were deployed simultaneously, from local detectives to armed officers, all coordinated with military-like precision. Each location had been carefully surveilled, and every member of the task force knew their role down to the smallest detail. This was not just an arrest operation, it was a carefully orchestrated dismantling of an entire criminal empire. The first wave hit the residential homes, linked to the cartel. Officers moved silently through narrow streets, cutting off escape routes before making entry. Behind closed doors, women who had once ruled an empire of shadows were startled awake in their nightwear. Properties that had seemed ordinary were anything but hidden compartments, stash rooms, and safes containing large sums of cash and weapons were discovered within minutes. The raids were executed in perfect synchrony, leaving the Birds no chance to destroy evidence or alert associates. Simultaneously, units targeted their small businesses and warehouses. Hair salons, cleaning firms, and corner shops that had served as fronts for years were raided, revealing packages of cocaine hidden within ordinary products. Investigators were struck by the sophistication of the concealment: false bottoms in crates, double-sealed containers, even hidden compartments in ordinary office equipment. It was a level of ingenuity that spoke to the careful planning the Birds had invested in their operations. The raids confirmed the scale of the enterprise. Over 200 kilos of cocaine, thousands of pounds in cash, and multiple firearms were recovered in a single coordinated sweep. The arrests were equally precise. Senior members, who had long been untouchable, were apprehended without incident. Younger couriers and peripheral associates were taken into custody as well, ensuring the network could not simply regroup once the leaders were removed. The operation was a testament to intelligence-led policing. Months of surveillance, wiretaps, and insider testimony had culminated in a single, decisive strike that left the cartel crippled. News of the takedown sent shockwaves through Liverpool's criminal underworld. Rival gangs, who had once underestimated the Birds, were forced to confront the reality that the matriarchy had been more formidable than anyone imagined. The elegance of the operation, combined with the sheer scale of arrests and seizures, made headlines not just locally but nationally. It was widely hailed as one of the most significant blows against organized crime in the city's recent history. Yet the operation was not only about punishment. It also symbolized a turning point in law enforcement strategy, demonstrating that even the most disciplined and secretive criminal networks could be dismantled with careful planning and patience. The Birds' empire, built over years through strategy, loyalty, and invisibility, had been undone in a single day. The grand takedown showcased the vulnerabilities of even the most calculated criminal organizations and marked the beginning of the end for a cartel that had once seemed untouchable. Even after the Birds were arrested and their empire dismantled, their presence continued to cast a shadow over Liverpool's criminal landscape. The shockwaves of the takedown were felt not just within the city, but across the underworld that had long underestimated women as serious players. Rival gangs, once dismissive of the matriarchy, were forced to re-evaluate their assumptions about power, influence, and strategy. The Birds had proven that control did not require violence or loud displays of dominance. It could be achieved through intelligence, discipline, and careful planning. Their methods left a chilling reminder that the underworld could shift in ways few expected. Inside prison walls, the senior members of the cartel were grappling with a new reality. Some retained a sense of pride, believing they had outsmarted the men around them for years. Others felt betrayed by family members who had cooperated with authorities, and the cracks in loyalty that had started before the arrests widened even further. Investigators reported that even behind bars, the Birds were quietly asserting influence among other inmates, demonstrating that their ability to inspire loyalty and command respect had not vanished entirely. Their legacy, it seemed, could not be contained by walls or sentences. For law enforcement, the case became a landmark example of modern organized crime. The Birds had challenged traditional policing assumptions that gangs were male-led, impulsive, and motivated by ego. The matriarchy had operated with patience, strategic thinking, and international connections, forcing authorities to adapt their approach to surveillance, intelligence, and cross-border coordination. Analysts studied the methods used by the Birds to understand how criminal networks could exploit gaps in conventional oversight. The case would influence investigations for years to come, shaping both policy and practice in tackling sophisticated organized crime. Yet the city itself was left with a sense of unease. For many Liverpool residents, the story of the Birds was not just about arrests or seizures. It was a revelation of how close a disciplined criminal network had operated under the radar for so long. Ordinary streets and small businesses had concealed an empire of smuggling, money laundering, and influence. The idea that such power could be held quietly by women who blended into everyday life left a lingering fear. It challenged notions of safety and perception, showing that appearances could be deceiving and that crime could flourish in silence. Across the criminal world, the Birds' name remained spoken with both respect and caution. Their success, even if ended by betrayal and police action, had inspired others to consider alternative approaches to power, less violent, more calculated, and rooted in loyalty. For historians and crime analysts, the Birds represented a turning point in the evolution of gangland culture, proving that the future of organized crime could take unexpected forms. In the end, the Birds' legacy was not measured solely in arrests or confiscated cocaine, but in the profound impact they had on the perception of criminal power. They had rewritten the rules, demonstrating that intelligence and strategy could rival brute force. Liverpool had witnessed the rise and fall of a matriarchy that had defied expectation, and even as law enforcement celebrated their victory, the city knew that the shadow of the Birds would linger for years. A reminder that power, when wielded cleverly, could leave scars that time alone could not erase.